Thank you everyone for coming to the TIPI webinar. We will get started in just a moment. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the TIPI College of Business's Life Lessons webinar. My name is Barbara Thomas, and I oversee alumni and constituent engagement for the TIPI College. Now, today our webinar is entitled All's Fair in Love and Money, How Money Can Affect Your Relationships. This webinar is one of 7 Life Lessons webinars that are designed to provide you with insight and ideas for each stage of your life. We recently added a 7th webinar that will focus on the tax implications at each stage. You can read more about it on our website. And I will include a link in the chat later on for that series. Now, all of our webinars are free and open to the public. We just ask that you register. So feel free to share this information with others that might want to attend. And as always, our webinars are recorded and shared both on the TIPI College's YouTube page and on our alumni web pages. Now, several days after our webinar, we will send out an email to all those who registered for this webinar with a link to the video with transcriptions. Now, before we begin, I want to reiterate that these webinars are to provide ideas, but are not providing you with official financial or legal advice. After attending our webinars, we encourage you to discuss issues with your own financial planner or lawyer. And please know that we cannot provide specific information on your personal situation. We really have to keep all of our answers at a very broad level. So today, during our webinar, you can actually submit your questions through the Q&A button found on your bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can. Our presentation today will be moderated by law professor Ann Esten. She holds the Aliber Family Chair in Law at the University of Iowa College of Law. She teaches and writes primarily in family law and international family law. She is a member of the International Society of Family Law and has served as an expert observer at the Hague Conference on Private International Law. She also teaches contracts and federal Indian law and serves as a pro bono consultant on professional responsibility issues for the Native American Rights Fund. Today, our panelists include Christine McIlvania, who is a partner at the Quad Cities Investment Group, a registered investment advisor. Now, with a mission of helping individuals reach their life goals through knowledge and better financial health, Christine consistently strives to understand the world through the eyes of others. Intrigued by unique qualities of people, she recognizes the one-of-a-kind stories in each person's life and then tailors her recommendations accordingly. Christine is a chartered financial analyst, certified financial planner, and received her MBA from the University of Iowa. Jacob Priest is an associate professor and director of Couple and Family Therapy Program in the College of Education at the University of Iowa. He also holds a secondary appointment in the departments of psychiatry and internal medicine at the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine. Jacob received a BS in Family Studies from Weber State University, an MS in Marriage and Family Therapy from Purdue University, and a PhD in Marriage and Family Therapy from Florida State University. He directs the LGBTQ Counseling Clinic in the College of Education and has a private practice at the Counseling Center of Iowa City. He lives in Cedar Rapids, Iowa with his wife, Chelsea, their kids, Keenan and Birdie, and their 4 cats. And lastly, Brianna Young is a shareholder attorney at Denton's Davis Brown Law Firm in Des Moines, specializing specifically in trusts and estates. She is a fellow of the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, a director of Iowa Academy of Trust and Estate Counsel, and a frequent speaker for the Iowa State Bar Association and other organizations. She is a 2001 graduate of the University of Iowa College of Liberal Arts and a 2004 graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law, where we learned she was a research assistant, I believe it was, for Professor Ann Eston. She loves dogs, coffee, and helping Iowans create their wills, trusts, and other legal documents to empower and protect themselves and the people and organizations that they care about. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists for your time today and our moderator, and I will turn it over to Ann. Take it away, Ann.
Thank you very much, Barb, and thanks to Tippy for organizing this series. It's great. Our plan is for each of the three panelists to spend about 10 minutes addressing their topic. The rest of us will mute our video while each panelist is talking. And we're going to be moving through different types of counseling, starting with Jacob and then moving on to the financial and legal dimensions of counseling. So Jacob, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. So I get to talk a little bit today about I guess more of the emotions surrounding money and how it affects relationships. If you talk to most therapists, they'll tell you that most people don't really argue about money. They argue about the things that money represents. But I find that that's kind of hard to disentangle. If you think about money, it also can kind of represent some of the biggest fears we bring to our relationship, right? Money in some sense can represent security. It can represent trust. It can represent status or power or control. It can represent the future, the past. It has a lot of meanings attached to it. And so what you'll find is often couples, when they are arguing about money, or whether it's families, whoever it might be, often these issues of security, trust, who has the ability to make decisions in the family are all wrapped into that. So when it comes to dealing with money in our closest relationships, I think it's important to remember a few things. The first thing is have conversations about it early and often, and make sure that these conversations are pretty intentional. Money is something that's going to span the life of a relationship. And if you're not comfortable talking about it, it can become something that, for lack of a better phrase, becomes the elephant in the room. So when you get into a relationship, or your relationship with siblings, parents, I think it's good to have conversations around money, because as we have them more frequently, they become easier. So, oftentimes when we think about having a conversation, we think about it as a one-time thing that we do. We have a conversation about money and then we've got it all figured out. But having multiple conversations across the duration of your relationship is key, because your values around money may shift, may change depending on the developmental time period your relationship is in. Your ability to spend may change, whether that's through an increase in finances or a decrease. And having a basis from which to build on when we talk about that can be really important. The second thing I think is good practice when talking about money is to learn what the people in your closest relationships, what values are most strongly attached to money. Does money represent, kind of like I talked about earlier, security? Is it a matter of trust? It is a matter of, hey, if we have this, I feel accomplished as a partner or a parent or a sibling or an aunt or an uncle or whatever it might be. I think it's really key to explore the values attached to that. And the way you can do that is by not having conversations about money just when there's conflict, but having conversations around money when it's relatively calm, if there's ever that time, and asking, okay, what does this mean to you, right? When we spend money on something, what's the value attached to that? How did you talk about money in your family growing up? Did you talk about it? What were the values that were passed along when it comes to money, whether they talked about it or not? And how are those similar or different from what you have or what your partner has or your other family members have? So I think that's another important thing. I also think it's important that oftentimes you're going to see in relationships discrepancies around how much people are comfortable spending or saving, what things are a priority, what things are not. And when it comes to those points of conflict, again, if you've had these conversations frequently around money and you're talking about the values associated with money, I think you can use those points of conflict in healthy ways. Meaning that often when there's a point of conflict in a relationship, it's a time for growth. It can be a time for growth if you utilize it correctly. And so when it comes to money, I think it's important at those times of conflict or when there's a discrepancy in what one person wants versus what the other person wants, it's really important to, again, take the space to talk about it, but use also the space to listen. Oftentimes when couples in particular have difficulties around money, they talk at each other, meaning one person's talking, as soon as the other takes a breath, the other person jumps in, right? And so it goes back and forth really quickly and you don't go anywhere. So good conversations, even through conflict, happen when we go slow. And that means by really trying to hear and listen to what your partner's saying and asking additional questions. Now, questions can sometimes be weaponized by couples. I see this all the time, right? You're asking a question to get a response that you know is going to be a point of conflict or a problem that's going to make it even worse or push a button, whatever it might be. But when it comes to wanting to be able to create an environment for listening and growing through conflict, you want to ask questions solely with the purpose to understand better. What do I mean by that? It's by saying, tell me more about what you're thinking here. I want to make sure I'm getting this. Is this what you're trying to say? When we ask questions like that, it gives space for the person to continue talking. It actually creates more safety because they see that the person is invested, and it becomes a place where they feel like they can have more of this open transparency around how they're feeling. If we ask questions that serve to make the conflict worse or to get yes or no answers, we're going to shut down that conversation. We're going to pull the safety and pull the trust out of there, and then it can become problematic. So often that's what I see as the major things that couples and families need to deal with when talking about money. Those values, being able to have these conversations that build across time, and being able to work through points of conflict, I think is really key to having successful conversations around money in close relationships. And I think that's my time, so I'll be quiet now.
Here I am working on unmuting myself. That was great, Jacob. Thank you. It reminds me of an early conversation in my marriage when the conversation eventually put me in touch with the fact that I was really unhappy in my job, and our fight about money was actually my worry about what if I have to quit. And so I learned from that conversation beyond just what the listening helped me. So thank you lots. But let's move on. You've already been introduced to Christina. So Christina, I'm going to ask you to unmute and start in, please. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christina McElvaney again. Obviously, some great tips from Jacob. I will kind of echo some of those as well as we talk through things and even take some tips on my own as a financial planner. I have these conversations quite a bit with clients and couples, and often in our meetings, it does seem like couple therapy. So maybe some people need to have a combined meeting with all of us with, couple therapy, financial planning, but kind of walking through different things with the financial aspect of a relationship. Once you decide that you're in a committed relationship with someone and want to build your life with them, whether that's living together or formally getting married and having that shared goal in life, you need to have a money talk if you haven't already. Like Jacob said, it's better to have them throughout your lives and even kind of building into it as you get into a relationship, but at least once you fully make that commitment to one another, not having to do it on like the first date, but once you get to that part of your relationship, even though it'd be nice if there was like credit reports on online dating, so you can kind of get some of that information before you get there. But open communication is key. Disclosure is key when you're first getting into a fresh new relationship. What is your current financial situation? You need to be knowledgeable on your own situation first. Do you have any credit card debt? Do you have student loan debt? Have you filed bankruptcy in the past? Things that could negatively impact your credit as a couple, whether that means, not qualifying for loans if you go to buy a house, or having to delay other goals because you're having to pay down some of that before reaching other things. But the past is the past. That's one thing too, that you can't change it. So you just learn from it. So if you do have a large amount of debt, just try to make some changes to make you put yourself in a better position in the future and to work together as a couple in that sense. On the other side of things, on the more positive side, it may not be as comfortable sharing the extent of like if you have an inheritance or family money. That situation kind of depends on the circumstance. Do you already own the assets, or is it just expected in the future? I know Brianna's probably going to touch base on some conversations with that around prenups or not commingling assets if you have other reasons why you don't want to combine assets together as you build your financial life. You need to also take into account each person's history and experience with money. I think Jacob kind of talked about that. Like we are either, you can be spenders or savers. Either you could have both combinations of either in your relationship, and it can work. Any combination can work as long as there is respect and common goals. So you need to understand the habits that they might not change. So establish early boundaries and conversation to limit kind of future resentment or bringing up things from the past years down the road. We're all shaped by like our parents' example, how people grew up with money, whether it was talked about or not, whether it was a hardship, trying to get through things, or if, how people just kind of spent and didn't pay attention along budgeting lines. So everyone has a wide range that they're bringing kind of their own financial baggage into a relationship that you need to kind of understand where your partner's coming from and kind of going from there together. Each person has different risk tolerance for comfort investing. Maybe you've never invested before. Maybe you've been investing for several years and have a lot of knowledge and experience with that. When we work with couples, we do a risk tolerance questionnaire, of course, to get an idea of how we should invest their assets. And we often joke that it's compatibility tests. One, they could be the same or they could be wide ranging. So then you kind of focus more on each person's area of how they would have comfort on those investments. Even in cash comfort level of with your bank accounts, how much cash do you have in there? Are you barely keeping enough to cover expenses, or can you not sleep at night unless you have a certain amount of cushion? You need to respect each of those when it comes to the relationship and find some sort of common ground. And one person can manage all the finances. Say, obviously with Tippy, a lot of people on this webinar probably have business experience, but maybe their partner doesn't. So it's okay if you have different knowledge levels or experiences and one person can manage the assets, but everyone should be aware of the situation. In one way, you need to do it just to protect yourself, because if down the road, if there's a breakup or a divorce or something happens to the other person, you need to be aware and protect yourself and your assets and your future goals in life. Previous generations, that's traditionally been the male in the relationship, but that's been a huge shift too, where we're seeing a lot more women are taking the forefront, the dealing with the finances, being the breadwinners. So there could be any combination throughout that with the partnership. It'd be good to have conversations to limit, establish some goals and priorities, common goals, whether you want to have needs or wants, and visualize the goals. I'm a financial planner. I like to kind of map out and put everything into a document that you can work the plan. Where you need to pay down debt, know the amount of debt that you have, the interest rates you have to pay, focusing on the highest interest rate first to make the biggest impact. Whether you need to save for emergency funds, house down payment, any upcoming trips or car purchases. Those would be the sort of things that you would want to save in like your bank accounts or taxable investment accounts, depending on the timing of when you would need those funds. Retirement, obviously, that's the main thing. It seems far off when you're starting out in a relationship, depending on where you are in your stage of life, but it's something that everyone needs to work towards and build for their future. Do you have an employer plans? Make sure you're getting your full match, Roth IRAs, things like that you can utilize. Even 5 to 9 accounts. If you're doing additional education for yourself, you can do that, or save for future colleges as well. Make sure to pay yourself first and automate savings, not as tempted to spend if it's already out of your bank accounts, and just respect each other and make decisions together. Goals can and will change over the life over time and throughout different stages of life. And Jacob kind of talked about this too, but talking about finances don't be painful. You can have money dates or check-ins or try to make it fun, but making it more frequent, like you said, it becomes less of an issue then, to kind of avoid only talking about when there's a problem. Kind of having it be, little discussions throughout. We have a client that does Money Mondays. I said, add some margaritas in there. You could have Margarita Money Mondays and kind of talk through things. Utilize, financial planning. If you work with a financial planner, kind of work through that. They can be mediators throughout, or couples therapy like Jacob does as well. And then kind of logistics of combining financial lives, how to split up shared expenses. It could be equally or proportionally, whatever is considered fair in your relationship. It doesn't have to be, X, everyone pays 50-50. It kind of depends on the dynamic of your relationship and income between the different partners. We did receive several questions on how to handle bank accounts. You could combine bank accounts, you could keep separate accounts, have like one shared account for all of your common expenses. Some people like to have mental accounting where they have a house bank account, they have your like rent or other expenses or trips, things like that. It kind of depends on whatever you want to do. So there's no wrong answer, but we've seen more too, like if people are more established before they get into relationships, or, maybe it's a second marriage or things like that, they might be more prone to keep things separate. There's nothing wrong with that. You can kind of focus on your separate financial plan, but still respect and work together with that as well. Establish guidelines or rules on spending. I would suggest maybe having a dollar amount that if you want to spend above that amount, you discuss it with your partner. You don't want to micromanage or nitpick about all the different expenses, to kind of make sure that you work your plan together. Maybe use some apps to combine accounts. Even if you're not titling and sharing accounts together, you can combine them virtually so you can be aware of the whole picture together. I like using mint.com. I think that there's tons of great ones out there that you can utilize as well. And even like once you get into like the later part of establishing your relationship, value each other's contributions. Not everyone is the main financial contributor into a relationship. Everyone brings value of it though. So you want to balance even the savings to kind of prove that. So if one spouse or partner stays home or has a job that doesn't pay as much, make sure to try to balance the savings as well, so that each person has value and feels that as when you get into relationships. I know Brianna will kind of talk through some of this too, of making sure that you review beneficiary designations, titling of accounts on property if you want it jointly held. Obviously, review life insurance coverage if you want to make sure that a partner would get your benefits with that. I'm more of a proponent for a term life insurance for whatever your specific needs are. And then establish estate planning documents. One thing too, once you're legally married, because we're talking about partnerships, it doesn't necessarily have to be legally married, but once you are, you're obligated for the person's debts. You got to help pay off, and that's a proponent. You want to make sure you'll be filing joint tax returns. So obviously, Barb mentioned that there's going to be a tax webinar down the road, but it changes your tax brackets, whether or not you are a joint filer or a single filer, whether or not you have different income contributions or other tax credits. Roth contributions, also if there's a stay-at-home spouse, whether a husband or wife or other partner, if you're married, you can have contributions to the person even if they don't have earned income, as long as there's enough to earn income between the two of you in the household. So that's something to keep in mind. If someone, takes a step away from their job or has some side jobs or things like that don't have necessarily as much income, they can still save and contribute. And then review employer benefits, whoever has the better health insurance, health savings accounts, things like that. But finally, just overall, make sure to educate yourself. You want to have a positive relationship with money and your partner. So have clear communication and establish boundaries. Try to learn financial skills or work with a financial professional. And don't be hesitant or insecure to ask questions. Everyone has questions, and you want to be aware and be financial literate through things. And never too young. You're never too young or have too little money to get help and start getting things going, because little changes early on make a big difference as you establish yourself and your partnership. So don't wait. And one thing too, we see this a lot with people, not just couples, but try not to compare yourself to others. Everyone's situation is completely different. and it puts unnecessary pressure on yourself and maybe your relationship if you're always comparing yourself to others. So even though all very general advice we're kind of going through, each individual situation is different. And I will have to say one thing with partnerships as well, with relationships, cautionary tale, to make sure to protect yourself. Run your annual credit report, make sure you know what accounts are being opened in your name, that there's nothing in there that you didn't yourself make, maybe even do like a credit freeze or things like that. Just good things all around, let alone, trying to manage the dynamics with love and whether relationships pick up. So that's it on my end right now. So.
Thank you, Christine. That's terrific. And I think the line I want to pick up from what you said is the line about how everyone should be aware of the situation, everyone in the relationship, even if one partner takes the lead, the importance of educating yourself. As a former divorce lawyer, I have to say that's the perfect segue to what Brianna is going to talk about, because relationships end. They end through divorce, breakup, they end through death, and sometimes very unexpectedly. So when we're younger, we don't tend to think so much about this kind of plan, but it might be worth contemplating the what if I get hit by a bus scenario, the very unexpected thing that might come from nowhere. Brianna, that's your assignment, I guess. Please.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. So that is a beautiful segue into the topic of premarital agreements. And a lot of you sent in some really good questions ahead of time about premarital agreements. So let's visit about that. What is a premarital agreement? So a premarital agreement is also sometimes referred to as a prenup or a prenuptial agreement. The Iowa Code defines a premarital agreement as an agreement between prospective spouses made in contemplation of marriage and to be effective upon marriage. So in other words, it's a legal contract that couples can sign before they get married that sets rules what happen to the couple's income and property in the event of divorce or death. And it is a premarital agreement. Some states recognize postmarital agreements, but Iowa does not. So the pre is important. The agreement has to be finalized before you're married. The general rule in Iowa is that if there's a divorce, the court will divide the property in a just and equitable way. And if one spouse dies, the other will inherit something. But a premarital agreement can change these general rules for the couple. So you're thinking, Brianna, I am not Elizabeth Taylor. Do I really need a premarital agreement? And the answer is you might. So if you're a business owner, for example, a premarital agreement can protect your company that you worked really, really hard to build in the event of a divorce. And as an extra added bonus, this can really help alleviate any anxiety that your business partners might have about what would happen if there's a divorce and what that would mean for your small business. Also, if you bring children into the marriage, a premarital agreement can ensure that you can pass assets along to them after your passing and protect the assets for their use and for your use if you end up getting a divorce. And even if you don't have many assets or much income now, the premarital agreement lets you lay out the way in which items that you might acquire will be treated if you die or if you get divorced. And this is especially important where one spouse has a lot of assets or earning potential or potential to inherit property and the other does not. And then also you might think about a premarital agreement if you have assets that you really want to keep. And the premarital agreement can apply to assets that you have now, but it can also apply to property that you buy or inherit in the future as well. In Iowa, divorce courts will typically award inherited property to the spouse who inherited that, but who inherited the property. But that can get a little tricky in some situations. So there's a case in Iowa called the McReynolds case, where before their marriage, husband and wife had signed a premarital agreement stating that any inherited asset would remain the property of the spouse who inherited it. So fast forward, they get married, and then years later, husband ended up inheriting money from his brother-in-law. And husband put that money into a joint account that he owned together with wife. Those joint account funds were then used to pay wife's taxes, and also husband told wife, well, we're going to take the rest of this money and we're going to spend the money on a Canadian cruise. Well, sadly, that cruise did not ever end up happening because husband and wife got a divorce. And in the divorce, the husband argued that the amount that he inherited should be credited to him and put on his side of the ledger in the divorce. But the Iowa Court of Appeals disagreed and ended up deciding that the inherited money was marital property because the husband treated it as such, treated it as though it belonged to him and the wife. So he didn't get that money put on his side of the ledger in the divorce. So I'd mentioned that a premarital agreement can take effect in the event of a divorce or death. So let's talk about divorce first. Lawyers have never been accused of being fun at parties. We like to talk about these heavy topics, but on the topic of divorce, there's a general rule that the divorce court will divide assets in a just and equitable way. So that's a pretty squishy standard, and that's intentional because the law wants to give the judge leeway to decide what's fair and kind of consider all of the circumstances. The premarital agreement can change this, and the parties can decide ahead of time how their property will be divided. So take an example, say Jane and Emma get engaged to one another and they sign a premarital agreement, and that agreement shows that Jane, who's a real dog lover, owns 10 shares of stock in Doggles Incorporated worth $100, and that Doggles stock is characterized as Jane's separate property. And if you haven't Googled doggles.com, I would highly recommend it. They're tiny little sunglasses for dogs, and it will absolutely make your day. So their agreement says that in the event of each spouse keeps all of her own separate property. All right. So the couple gets married, they sign their premarital agreement, they get married, and then later they divorce. And by that time, the value of Jane's Doggles stock has soared to over $50,000 because the public has recognized that dogs are amazing and deserve their own sunglasses, right? So in that case, the divorce court would award the stock and all of its appreciation value to Jane because that was specified in the premarital agreement that would be the case. So that's divorce, but premarital agreements can also decide what happens after death. And just as a general, very gross overgeneralization, in Iowa, if someone dies without a will, the surviving spouse is going to be entitled to, generally, either about half of all of the probate assets or all of the probate assets, depending on whether or not that deceased spouse had any children from a previous relationship. So in other words, the spouse is going to get something in general. If someone dies with a will in Iowa, the surviving spouse generally has the right to come in and receive about 1/3 of the probate assets, regardless of what the will says. And again, gross oversimplification, but that's the general rule. And if the spouse makes that choice to come in and take 1/3 of the probate assets, regardless of what the will says, that's called taking against the will or taking the elective share. A premarital agreement can change this, and the parties can waive their right to take an elective share. So I know of a case where a farmer died, and his only asset was a farm that had been in his family for over 100 years. So it was a century farm. And prior to his death, the farmer signed a will that left nothing to his wife, and instead it left that farm to his nephews, who he had farmed the land with. In general, wife would be entitled to come in after husband dies and take against the will. So she would receive 1/3 of the value of the farmland, even though the will left the farm to the nephews. In that case, the nephews would have to sell the farm or divide it up or do something so that they could pay wife for her 1/3 share. However, However, before farmer and wife married, they signed a premarital agreement. And that agreement stated that the farm was farmer's separate property and he was free to do with as he wished in his will or trust. So that led to a very different result where the nephews ended up with the farm and they're still operating it to this day. So premarital agreements can do a lot. There are some limitations on what they can do. They cannot change anyone's right to alimony or child support. Those are rights that a person can have after divorce, regardless of what the premarital agreement says. And the agreements cannot also cannot make decisions about custody of children. But I'm a wills and trust lawyer, and I administer probate estates. But I was talking with my wonderful, wonderful law partner, Tyler Coe, this morning, who's a family law attorney, just an amazing person, loves dogs as well. And he said that one thing that people have been doing more and more in their premarital agreements is including provisions for who gets the dog or who gets the cat. So, and he said that he's finding that courts typically do enforce those provisions. So if we get a divorce, then Harry the dog goes to this spouse, and courts have been holding that up. So there are certain rules, real quick, for making sure that premarital agreements will stick, for making sure that they're enforceable. The agreement has to be in writing and it has to be signed by both spouses. Iowa courts can throw out a premarital agreement if the court finds that one of the spouses didn't get a fair and reasonable disclosure of the other spouse's property or debts, or if the agreement was unconscionable when it was signed, or if one of the spouses didn't sign it voluntarily. And you do have to be very careful on that last one, but courts tend to interpret voluntary pretty broadly. So there's a case called the Spiegel case, and I'm sure Professor Eston is familiar with this case, where the husband-to-be was very, very rich, wife-to-be not so much. She was in the arts, lover, love the arts, love artists, but big imbalance. So husband-to-be first mentioned the idea of a premarital agreement to wife-to-be 5 months before the wedding. The court says the wife flatly rejected the suggestion, stating under no circumstances would she be married with a prenuptial agreement. So fast forward to 10 days before the wedding, husband brings up the topic again, and wife became upset and stated she had not changed her mind. 5 days before the wedding, the tenacious groom presented his bride-to-be with a premarital agreement, and the court said she was, quote, decimated, and decided it was time to hire a lawyer. So less than 24 hours before the wedding, the bride and groom got together with their attorneys in a meeting that the Iowa Supreme Court described as, quote, tense and emotional. Husband represented to wife that he had never actually read the terms of the agreement. For that reason, the wife had her attorney read the agreement aloud and lied my line in husband's presence, hoping that when he heard it, he would realize its import and tell her that she didn't need to sign. But when reading the document failed to change his mind, she turned to him and said, "Is this really what you want?" He said yes, and she signed. It will shock you to know that the marriage did not last. The court called the marriage, quote, rocky from the start. So when the Supreme Court of Iowa calls your marriage rocky from the start, that's saying something when a court would say that. In the divorce proceedings, the wife said that she signed the premarital agreement under duress and that it should be held unenforceable. The court actually disagreed, ruling that the wife was not acting under duress. Because she had independent counsel who informed her in detail of her rights, and also she could have canceled the wedding, which would have been embarrassing, but not the end of the world. So the court said she signed the agreement voluntarily, albeit reluctantly. So a lot of information, but just a summary, a premarital agreement really can simplify the division of assets if there is a divorce, but it can also ensure that each spouse is free to dispose of their property exactly as they wish in a will or a trust, without any concern that the surviving spouse will take a share of the estate regardless. And also, please don't wait until 24 hours before your wedding date. Having your premarital agreement signed at least 4 months, 6 months before the wedding, with each spouse having their own separate attorney is best. And then you can sign on and move on with the fun parts of planning the wedding and planning for the marriage. So I know we've got lots of good questions and I want to leave plenty of time. So that's all I have on premarital agreement.
That's another great segue. In a sense, we're full circle back to Jacob, because those conversations around a prenup are also very difficult conversations. And for lawyers and financial planners working at the front end of relationship, wanting to keep it together, even as people are talking about the possibility of an end, that's a tricky balancing act. I did want to mention that when you go to someone like Brianna or Tyler to get that prenuptial agreement, you probably want to write wills, advance medical directives. There's a whole series of ways of thinking about those things in the future we don't want to think about that are a good idea to take care of at the same time. And I also want to point out that even people in cohabitation relationships have these complicated money conversations. Their finances get tangled up in some of the kinds of ways Christine was talking about. And written agreements might make a lot of sense for people in that cohabitation context, not just people who are about to get married. But Barbara, I'm going to turn this back to you for managing the Q&A.
You bet. So kind of to follow up on that, Anne, I think, like in the back of my head, I've always heard that like 7 years is perhaps when a common law relationship is considered official. Is there a year?
No.
Okay.
Thank you for giving. In my family law class in law school, every one of us thought if you lived with someone for 7 years, you were married. It's like what property lawyers call adverse possession. And that is not how it works in any state. There are only some states that have common law marriage. Iowa is one of them. The requirements are that you have to live together, to cohabit as a married couple, but also hold yourselves out in the community as a married couple. So if you're not telling people you're married, if you're not acting like you're married, it's not a common law marriage. So I thank you for giving me a chance to make this point. On the other hand, if you do hold out as married, the fact that it was a common law marriage does not change the rules for divorce. You still have to get a formal official divorce. There's no such thing as a common law divorce. There are housing offices, it used to be, including the University of Iowa, that would let couples sign an affidavit of common law marriage in the housing office to sign up for married student housing back in the day. The result is they are married from having signed that piece of paper, whether they thought about it in those terms or whether they thought they were just getting the housing situation they wanted. So if you've ever signed one of those pieces of paper and broken up, you should go see a divorce lawyer pronto.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to send to Brianna. Brianna, let's, going back to the prenuptials. Are the rules different state by state? What if you get married in state A and have a prenup, but then end up living in state B and then get divorced? Is there issues because now you're living in a different place?
That's a very, very good question. So Iowa has essentially adopted the Uniform Premarital Agreements Act, which a lot of states have adopted. So that means that most attorneys in several states will be familiar with how an Iowa premarital agreement works, because it's probably going to look a lot like a premarital agreement in their state if they're also in a uniform state. That said, if a premarital agreement was enforceable in the state in which it was signed, other states will recognize that premarital agreement too. Professor Estin, I'm sure you may have a lot more insight on this issue than I do, because I typically see individuals who move from other states to Iowa asking me if the agreement is enforceable and not so much the other way around.
The divorce laws are different from state to state, similar but different. So it is possible that you would need And this relates to one of the questions in the Q&A, right? What happens midstream if you discover that your out-of-state prenup is maybe not ideally optimized for Iowa law? The tricky thing in Iowa, and Brianna can answer this better than I, is because we don't recognize marital agreements, because it has to be premarital agreements, it's difficult to adjust that. And there are situations that look very coercive. It looks like marital agreements sometimes are, I will divorce you unless you agree to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And those kinds of agreements set off alarms and red lights. And so that's the reason that Iowa on the divorce law side has drawn this clear line about it has to be before marriage, not during marriage. The inheritance lawyers would like Iowa to change that rule, because oftentimes people don't really start doing their estate planning until they're midway through a relationship, and their mortality, I suppose, seems more real. So it is tricky to have a prenup and try to change it, whether that's because circumstances have changed or because you've relocated. But I defer to the real lawyers who are in practice in terms of how to address those situations.
There is a fairly newly amended statute, Iowa Code 633.238, one of my favorite statutes, and that statute now has been amended to enable married couples to create a certain type of trust that both spouses have to sign certain things pertaining to, that can mean that my spouse can waive their right to that spousal election if I die. So they can waive their right to come in and take a third of my probate assets, oversimplification, after my death. So there is a little bit of agreement making that you can do even after you're married. But that's only helpful after you die. That's not helpful in the event of divorce. So it's not a postmarital agreement, like Professor Eston said. Iowa doesn't recognize postmarital agreements.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So Jacob, I'm going to go to you next. We definitely have some questions about kind of the complications in relationships. Some of them have to do with having the conversation when someone has a great deal of anxiety or concern. And, it's great if you're both at that lovely common ground, but what do you do when this, just broaching this topic is a great level of concern for the one person? How could the other person kind of help guide that conversation along?
So the first thing I think would be to talk about the anxiety, right? If it's more of a conversation where a conversation about money brings anxiety, let's talk about the anxiety first. And how I'm talking about it? Is it an experience you've had? What's going on that's triggering that anxiety so strongly? And I think the other thing you can do too is always give people the space to know that it's okay to bring their feelings into a conversation, right? Hey, I've noticed in the past, sometimes you get really anxious when we talk about money. Do you want to talk about that? Right? That gives them a bridge to say, oh, and a lot of times people can be like, thank you. I haven't known how to bring this up. I really have wanted to say this. And if you can do that, if you can give them that bridge, that helping hand to get into that space, oftentimes they're really going to thank you for that, right? A lot of times anxiety is triggered because it's a perceived threat. And when we perceive threats, we tend to narrowly focus on them and distort them. That's just what our brains do. And so oftentimes, if you can create the space to bring that emotion up, it can lower the level of anxiety and then creates more options.
Good answer. And, that kind of ties into one of the questions in our Q&A where they talk about, a couple and that hasn't been having as many of those frequent conversations. And, the concern of and now I'm finally bringing it up. What does that feel like? And I think there it probably comes back to the idea of a bridge of being honest and sharing. Perhaps it could be saying, I saw this great webinar and it inspired me to have this conversation. So there you are. We've provided you with the bridge. to start that conversation. But any other advice for someone when there is, like, okay, I've never talked about it before, but now I want to talk about it?
Yeah, I think what you've said right there is an excellent bridge. We've never really talked about this before, except for when we're in conflict. I don't really want to have conflict around this with you. I love you. I'm committed to you. So why don't we start talking about it differently? Is there anything you think we could do differently? I've been thinking about it. And also, one of the other things, and this is with all big relationship conversations, you can bring it up, but that doesn't have to be the time you discuss it. Like, hey, I've been thinking about this. I'd like to talk about it, but I want to give you space to think about it too. Like, take some time, think about it, and maybe in a couple of days when, like things are a little more calm, we can have a touch base about it. And then it's not like we need to create all the answers then, but just, I want to start this conversation. So taking it slow, being open, but transparent about what you're thinking, like, I think is important.
One other thought on that, Barb, as well, is that you want to be aware before something happens. And so you want to know what accounts we have, what we're invested. If something were to happen to you, if one of the partners manages everything, the other one, if they aren't aware at all, they wouldn't even know where to go or what to do. And so having those conversations ahead of time, and that's a way to kind of open it up as well of, if something happens to you, I'm worried, I want to know what to do or where to even go to get our assets. So kind of have that as a leeway to kind of talk.
Great. And Christine, you kind of covered some of those, but we, just like we did have lots of questions about should couples have the joint bank account, is there advice for kind of newlyweds or about to be marrieds of just, stop and think about these few things? You said it, but I'm wondering, there would just be a little value in kind of reiterating those top points of the things to think about.
Yeah, well, the problem is that every situation is completely different. So this is discussions that you have to have in your partnership of where is your comfort level? Do you like keeping your own account because that gives you safety and comfort? Also, hopefully the relationship goes well, but what if it doesn't? You want to protect yourself. And if you have past relationships, if you have kids, things you kind of have to keep in mind as well. And so you could have maybe separate accounts and have maybe one combined account. I knew someone years ago that used to invoice each other, that they used to send each other bills between their accounts, or there's a variety of things that you can do as opposed to just kind of the traditional everyone combines all the accounts, which there's nothing wrong with that either. Because obviously, legally, we've already kind of talked about it, that even if they're not titled to you, it's marital assets for everything, unless there's other documents in place. So within that, it's more of, your choice and ease, So that's where if maybe you have a bank or a credit card you've always had, keep that in your name, because that would help with your credit report as well. But maybe then use some apps to be able to see everything together and automate that process of it. So thankfully, with all the electronic funding, there's different ways you could transfer money between each other and kind of combine things as well. So unfortunately, there's not one great answer. It kind of just depends on your situation.
Exactly. So the website you mentioned was mint.com. Is that right?
Yes, that's one. There's so many. That's just one that I use and am familiar with.
And that is a site where you can kind of put in both of your assets, but see the full picture.
Yes. Yes. So mint.com is a company. It's an Intuit company. So like QuickBooks, it's a very high, reputable, safe company. And then you can sign it up to have read-only access to all of your accounts, bank accounts, credit cards. Everything can be in there all in one place to track spending. You would be able to track all your investments, everything as well. So each person can work together to combine them.
Great. Anne?
I think I want to chime in partly on this thread and partly some of the questions in the Q&A, because I'm at the stage of my life where, over 40 years of cohabitation and then marriage, I think at a spousal level, we have things sorted out, but there's that question about the next generation. And our version of getting hit by a bus is what happens if something happens to both of us. And suddenly our kids have whatever the mess of our combined financial scenario is to sort out everything from the dog, down. And so having done some of this with my parents and my in-laws, my mother had a little notebook that she got from somewhere that said, information for my executor. And it went page by page and, list your insurance policies and your bank accounts and those kinds of things. And I'm not relying on a little book, but, literally within the last 2 or 3 months, I have been working on the document and sending it to my kids who don't want to think about the possibility that we'll get hit by a bus. But now that's where my anxiety is that the information has to be transferred to them. And it's not so much about what our intentions are. We won't have a complicated sort of estate. Things just kind of get split in a very straightforward way, hopefully. But someone's going to have to do the work of finding all the stuff and, interacting with companies to get a stock account passed on to the beneficiaries. Some of those companies were actually quite easy to work with, and some of them were not. There was a lot of legwork involved. I had a medallion signature guarantee. I had no idea what this was after doing all kinds of legal, personal financial related work. And suddenly I'm calling my banker. Luckily, in Iowa City, I had the kind of banker I could call and say, what is this medallion guarantee? How am I going to get that? So that can be such a complicated, and it's a version of Love and Money, right? It's just the next generation version.
Absolutely. And that is a fabulous lead in for me to just remind you about this wonderful series that we have. So if you have more questions about all those documents, wills, power of attorney, where do I keep it, the safety deposit box, like for instance, you need to have those kids' name on that safety deposit box, or else they cannot get in there without a whole bunch of steps, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to cover topics like that in our 4th webinar, which is called Getting Your Ducks in a Row, the documents you need and the difficult conversations you need to have. Because in many of those cases, there sometimes is someone, it could be a parent, it could be a spouse, who does not want to talk about their death. But it is important that every person, as they progress through life, takes care of those things that Anne mentioned, that they have those accounts, digital assets, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to dive into that. That event is actually on November 8th. And prior to that, in early October, on October 5th, we have our next webinar, which is on buying and securing your nest, I think it is. So it all has to do with, now that you potentially are in this partnership, what do you need to consider as you start to purchase a house, as you start to have a family? And we're going to hear from a variety of experts who will help us kind of as we negotiate that, in addition to a very valuable help on somebody who's going to talk about picking your financial planner. Because it's very important that you think about doing that, and you think about doing that early. And I think from this whole discussion today, you realize the value that professionals in our community bring. So I think that all of you might step back and think about, I should talk to, maybe it's a family counselor, a financial planner, or perhaps an estate lawyer. So our hope through all of these webinars is to provide you with some applicable, usable information. And so we hope that we have done that today. So we are kind of wrapping up on time. I want to again thank all of our panelists today for helping us and providing kind of a great conversation and a lot of things to think about. Now, when this program ends, you'll get a survey, and in that, we'd love to hear what you thought. But if you have other ideas for different webinars, bring them. We'll try to figure out what else we can provide to you. We are all about providing lifelong learning opportunities for you that may not be kind of your traditional, you're not seeking a degree, but boy, you need to know this information. There are a lot of experts here at the Tippie College of Business and at the University of Iowa who can provide expertise to you, as well as our amazing group of alumni, many of which are here today. So with that, again, I want to thank you. Please join us for some of our future webinars. All of the webinars are recorded, so you can go back and see any of them. And with that, I want to say thanks. And of course, go Hawks. Thanks, everyone.